In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a reusable pad with a Windpro fleece core. And this makes it so that you can put jersey on one side and then a really nice soft cotton sherpa on the other. And it makes a reversible pad where the jersey side is light absorbency and the cotton sherpa side is a moderate absorbency. You want to make sure that you place the right side of the jersey facing the right side of the cotton sherpa. And I'm using the Sunshine Bums pattern. You can see that I've already traced it on there. If you want to purchase it, you can find a link in the description. Then you're just going to trim off the excess fabric, leaving at least a 1/2 inch of seam allowance. Now we're going to add the Windpro core, and what I'm showing you right here is that I like to put the fuzzy side facing down so that when the pad is finished, that side will have contact with the jersey, but you can really do it either way. And the important thing is that the jersey and the sherpa top sides should be facing one another, and the Windpro is on the bottom of both of those layers, and then you just want to cut off any excess fabric. Next, make sure that all of the layers are flat and smooth and then pin them together. And this is probably a good time to mention that this pattern is a little bit different than a typical pattern that you would buy from the fabric store because we'll be stitching directly onto the pattern line rather than onto an imaginary seam allowance. For sewing the layers together, you want to use the straight stitch, and I usually set it a tiny bit longer than normal just because of the thickness of all the layers. I always start stitching about 1/4 inch beyond the opening markings, and then I back stitch for a few stitches and then go forward again so that the stitching doesn't come undone. And now you just want to stitch all the way around the pattern line until you get to the other end of the opening and take a few back stitches there as well. And you really want to take your time to stitch on the line carefully and exactly because this is going to create the shape of your pad. Okay. Next, we need to clip the corners. And so you want to clip in no more than about 1/8 inch away from the sewing line. And now you'll need some pinking shears to cut off the excess fabric. And you want to leave about 1/4 inch seam allowance away from the stitching. And what I hope you can notice right here is how I leave a little bit of extra seam allowance at the opening, about 1/3 inch rather than 1/4, just to make sure that when I'm sewing the opening shut, everything stays nice and secure within the stitching. Now we need to turn the pad right side out, and we need to be careful here so that we don't rip the fabric at the opening. Notice how I put my thumb through the opening and connect it to my middle finger that's placed on the end of the pad. Then I pull that end through the opening. Then I put my middle finger on the other end of the pad and I just sort of pop it through the opening, and then I'm able to pull the rest of the fabric through after it. And in that way it doesn't put too much pressure on the opening stitches. And it really doesn't have to look perfect at this point because we're going to be ironing it next. In order to shape the pad, you're going to need a turning tool, and my favorite one to use is the Clover point-to-point turning tool. As you can see, I just do one little section at a time. I use the turning tool to make the edge get really nice and round and smooth, and then I iron over that part of the pad, and I keep going around the edges in the same way. This is one of my favorite parts of making a pad because the pad really starts to take shape and look beautiful, And I really like to spend time on making sure that the pad opening gets folded in a way that looks nice and neat. So sometimes you have to take some time and really fiddle with that to make it just perfect. Then flip the pad over and iron the back side of it just to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. And I always put a pin in the opening so that I remember where I need to be careful when I'm doing the top stitching. So I like to begin top stitching by doing a quilter's knot. And in order to do a quilter's knot, you need to set your machine to the straight stitch and then set the length to almost 0, just a little bit more than 0, and then take 3 or 4 stitches. And then you can either use the straight stitch or you can use the serpentine stitch. You can Google serpentine stitch and the brand name of your sewing machine in order to figure out that setting. And I just like to use the serpentine stitch on pads because I think it gives it a nice quilted texture, but the straight stitch is good too. And you just want to stitch about 1/4 to 1/5 of an inch away from the edge. And if you're using the serpentine stitch, then when you get to the opening of the pad, you want to make sure that you stitch a little bit closer to the edge just to make sure that you catch all of that seam allowance in there and make it nice and secure. Okay, so what I want to show you here is that I always like to get out a regular needle and thread the ends of the top threads back through to the back side because I like for the top of the pad to have a nice, clean, finished look. And then just trim the excess thread. And before I put snaps on, I always like to iron the pad one more time to make it nice and flat. And now for the snaps. I have an industrial cam snap press, but you can also use the handheld snap press and it works just as well. I usually just eyeball where I want the snap to be, but you can also use the pattern piece in order to mark the pad before you put the snaps in. And the reason why you can see I've used a different color of snap for the male snap is because I use color coding to show absorbency, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. But you want to be careful and make sure that the snaps are facing in the right directions. So if the male snap is facing to the bottom of the pad, then the female snap needs to be facing to the top of the pad and vice versa. So now we're done, and thank you for watching. If you're interested in more reusable pad tips or information about uploads or to purchase pads or the pattern, you can find me at my Etsy shop and also on Instagram, and I'll leave links for those in the description. And thank you for being here.